There's a camera that I have been meaning to talk about for quite a while now on my channel. This is a mirrorless mount camera, so you can put a speed booster on it and get that full frame look. It can shoot 4K with a log profile. It's got all the hardware features you'd want, and it's only like $3,000. And that's the JVC LS300. Now, if you haven't heard of the JVC LS300, don't blame yourself. It's not a really popular camera. It's actually more of like a hidden gem, kind of underground or under the radar for a lot of people. Although there are a few people who have talked about this quite a bit. A lot of people in my comments have asked me what I think about this camera. Now, I did shoot with the JVC LS300 a couple months ago, but I have been so incredibly busy with all the shoots that have been going on. If you want to keep up with any of that stuff, you can follow me over on Instagram, because that's where I post more of my like up-to-date recent stuff with all the shoots that are going on. But in terms of making YouTube videos, it's pretty difficult to do the YouTube channel stuff when I've got so many projects that need to get done as well. Shoots, edits, all sorts of stuff. So I wanted to put together this video. Now, before we get too far into this, I should say this is not a proper review. I'm not gonna show test footage. I'm not gonna have any behind the scenes of using the camera. I have all that footage ready to go, but it just takes time to edit. This is gonna be me pretty much talking about the JVC LS300, my personal experience with it, some of my opinions, things you need to watch out for. But like I said, it's not going to have any of the polish or anything that you'd really want out of a review. It's just going to be me kind of talking. So I apologize for that. It's just taking the time to edit that together takes time, and I don't have time right now. But there are people who've been asking me about the LS300, specifically my thoughts on it, and so I thought I'd put together this quick review in case anyone out there is looking at either buying or renting this camera, or maybe they're looking at something else and they haven't heard of this and maybe this is a good option for them. I wanted to at least get my thoughts and opinions out there so that if you want, you can listen to them, hear what I have to say, and then see how maybe that will apply to your shoots. Now, on paper, the JVC LS300 looks fantastic. Like I said, this camera shoots 4K internally to SD cards. Great. Cheap media, 4K quality, I love 4K, so I love that. It's got a log picture profile. When this camera first came out, it didn't have log, and a lot of people kind of held that against it. They're like, we need a log picture profile. Well, JVC listened, they updated the firmware, added log to the camera. So that is not a problem anymore. So you get that nice color grading, capability later in post-production if you want, but you don't have to shoot with it. The price point, it's like, when it first came out, it was like $4,000 or $5,000, I think, but now it's so discounted that it's like $3,000. I think I've even seen prices lower than $3,000. So if you pair that with a speed booster for maybe, another $600, you're looking at below $4,000 for a 4K camera that's essentially a full frame. It is a super 35mm sensor with a micro 4/3 mount, but again, pairing that with the speed booster, that's gonna give you an almost one-to-one full frame look. So if you have full frame glass, you can throw it on there and it works, and it's an active mount. So other cameras like the Blackmagic Cinema camera that came out with the micro 4/3 mount, but it was a passive mount, so you couldn't electronically control it. The JVC LS300 has an electronic mount, so you can control all the electronics, whether it's native micro 4/3 lenses or you're adapting something else. I think that's another reason this camera is not that popular. It's because it's kind of a weird pairing, a super 35mm sensor with a micro 4/3 mount. Super 35 is a bigger image sensor than micro 4/3. So if you're using micro 4/3 lenses on this camera, they may not actually cover the sensor. But JVC has actually done something pretty smart where they allow kind of intelligent cropping of the sensor to match the image area that you're working with. So if you're using micro 4/3, it crops in a little bit on the sensor to actually give you micro 4/3. But if you're using, like passive, like just dummy adapters, you can use your full frame lenses on there. You can use super 35 lenses on there or APS-C. So you can kind of mix and match. And this is a really great way that they've been able to implement a bigger sensor size on a micro 4/3 mount itself. So the sensor is super 35. The mount itself is micro 4/3. But that's great because micro 4/3 is pretty popular. Thanks to cameras like the GH4, there's a lot of adapters out there, whether they're Metabones smart adapters or speed boosters or just the cheap dummy adapters you can find online on eBay or Amazon. They're pretty common and they're really cheap, so you can put pretty much any glass you want on the LS300. The LS300 also has pretty much all of the ports, all of the hardware features that you would like. You can look up the spec sheet yourself if you don't believe me, but it's got HDMI, it's got HD-SDI, it's got built-in ND filters, which is huge for a lot of people. A lot of people like the convenience of just having ND filters right in the camera. LS300 has them. When you look at this camera on paper, it has pretty much every spec that you would want if you were designing or kind of picking your own features, kind of a best of, all right in this camera. So why isn't it more popular? Well, I think it's because the launch, like I said, it had a few things that were missing, so people were kind of disappointed. The sensor size with the mount is not immediately popular. A lot of people like EF mounts, for their Canon glass, or they like the Sony mounts because now the A7 cameras are really popular and they know that it's a full frame mirrorless mount. So the mount and the sensor, a little weird, a little concerning for people. And I also think the JVC brand doesn't resonate really strongly with a lot of people. They think it's kind of more broadcast or news rather than something that you would want to use for high-end video production or filmmaking. But I can say that the LS300 works fantastically. In my time using it, I didn't run into any bugs or flaws. I didn't have any major problems. All the hardware worked exactly the way I wanted it to. It really is everything you would want in one package, but there is something that you have to know, and this may be something that is only specific to me or the camera that I was using. It was a rental, so there is that variable. But there was a pretty big problem for me, and it's something that I would recommend everyone rent this camera before you go out and buy it, because like I said, it sounds great, but try before you buy. Because when I looked at the footage and got it back from the shoot, the footage all looked like it had been like heavily noise reduced. Like if you've run Neat Video or any kind of noise reduction software on footage where it has that kind of plasticky look, where it's got a sheen to it, where there's not that fine grain and texture to the image, that's what the footage looked like. And I thought, oh no, I'd made a huge mistake. I must have not seen the noise reduction setting. So I went through the menus again. Whenever I get a camera, the first thing I do is I go through the menu like 10 times just to make sure, whether it's on the airplane or overnight. If I get a new camera in my hands, I want to make sure I am 100% familiar with it. And I thought maybe I had overlooked something. I went through that menu again and again and again. I could not find a single setting that would allow you to adjust the amount of noise reduction. So I thought maybe it's some other setting. Nope, sure enough, I was in log mode, so there's not really much picture control you have. You're shooting log. So I reached out to JVC on Twitter. I reached out to multiple accounts on Twitter. I reached out to multiple email addresses asking, like, what's going on? Why does my footage look this way? It didn't look bad, but it just looked like it had too much noise reduction applied. Like I want some of that grain. I want some of that texture, some of that. It adds a sharpness and a quality to it that I really like. And, maybe for you, if you were looking at it, you'd say, this looks great. There's no noise. I love it. But for me, I was losing some of those fine details and I wanted that back. And I couldn't figure out a way to do it. And no one from JVC could give me a straight answer, whether it was on Twitter or on email. All the support people I reached out to kind of gave me some other solutions, but when I asked them point blank, I said, is there a noise reduction setting? No one could really give me an answer, and it didn't seem like there was one. So I don't know if this is an oversight. Like most cameras, when you have your picture profile settings, even on the GH4 when you're shooting log, you have a sharpness and a noise reduction setting, and I usually turn that more down than I would turn it up. You may be different. Maybe you like getting rid of your noise in camera, and so you don't have to worry about it in post-production. I kind of like the flexibility and the option to do it in post. So when I saw this footage, I was a little underwhelmed. I had shot the JVC LS300 right next to the GH4, and comparing them, they looked good, except the GH4 had this nice fine detail, this texture that the LS300 just didn't have. And so for me, looking at all the specs, having essentially a full frame 4K camera for around $3,000, I'm like, this is fantastic. This is why don't more people have this? But you look for reviews online, and there's not a lot of people out there talking about it. A lot of the information is a little bit outdated because it's from when the camera first came out, and they've updated it with firmware since. So there's so many different variables at play with any kind of camera, but it's helpful when you have other people out there who have experience with it. But unfortunately, the LS300 isn't that way. So if you have any experience with the LS300, and maybe I missed something, it's totally possible that there's some hidden setting. You've got to plug it into your computer, or you've got to do some special firmware unlock. I don't know what I was doing or how I could have fixed the problem I had, but that one problem would be caution enough for me to say that you absolutely need to rent this camera. Try before you buy, shoot test footage before you commit to anything, because you never know exactly what the one Achilles heel is going to be on any camera for that matter. You know, it could be anything. On paper, though, the LS300 is definitely worth checking out because I do think it is significantly underrated. There are so many cameras out there offering so much, and yet still falling short. You know, cameras that have everything you would want, but they don't have a mirrorless mount. That's one of my main gripes with the Ursa Mini, which I have in a bag over there because we're using on this shoot. If you couldn't tell, I'm in a hotel room right now. Again, really trying to just slap a video together to share my opinion. But you have cameras like the Ursa Mini that don't have a mirrorless mount option. So if you like the Speedbooster full frame look, you can't get that with the Ursa Mini. There's other cameras, or they don't have built-in ND filters, or they only have HDMI and they don't have SDI, or they have SDI and they don't have HDMI. The LS300 has pretty much everything I would want, aside from maybe internal stabilization on the sensor, but you can always get a stabilized lens to kind of compensate for that. And even that as a feature is not commonplace yet. It probably will be in the next year or two as more and more cameras add it. Sony is coming out with like the A6500 and their A7 cameras that have internal stabilization. The GH5 is most likely going to have internal stabilization. So that is a feature that the LS300 doesn't have. But pretty much everything else from a camcorder, cinema perspective, all in one, it really is such a great looking camera on paper. But that one little gripe, it's so insignificant. It feels so insignificant. But for me, looking at the footage, that's the ultimate test, right? I can work with if I have built-in ND filters or not. I can do workarounds on set as long as the final footage is exactly what I want it to be. And if I can't fix that on the LS300, then even if it has all of the hardware specs and the spec sheet is exactly what I would want, if the footage doesn't live up to all of that, then it's kind of a moot point. And even if it is only $3,000, I'd probably spend the extra $1,000 or $2,000 getting something that's going to give me exactly what I want. So is the LS300 something that you should, buy? Well, I don't know. That's probably up for you to decide. Look at the footage, see if you have the same problem that I ran into. Maybe it doesn't bug you as much as it bugs me. Maybe it was a flaw with the camera I had, but it seemed really weird because on the LS300, even when I would crank up the ISO or the gain, I wasn't seeing any significant noise introduced into the picture, even at night shooting in low light. So I knew there was some kind of noise reduction going on. It's got to be what it was. Talking to JVC, they were kind of suggesting a few other things, but that alone, cranking up my ISO and not seeing more noise or significantly more noise, kind of told me that was in fact the problem or what I was noticing. So maybe there's other cameras out there, the LS300, other versions of the LS300 where you can dial in your noise reduction. I don't know. I don't have access to those cameras. All I had was the rental. So at some point I may rent it again, but it's also getting to that point where we're a couple years removed from when it first came out. So it's, there's newer, later, the latest and greatest is always coming and it's right around the corner. So sometimes it feels like you're a step backwards to go back to something a little bit older. However, if you're fine with that noise reduction, because maybe you like the fact that you can shoot in lower light or crank your ISO and you get noise reduction right in camera, maybe that's great. Maybe that works for you. The LS300 is a steal for everything that you're getting right in one self-contained unit. The only thing that would compare to it would possibly be the Sony FS5 in terms of all the hardware features, and that's a good $2,000 extra. So if you're trying to save money, the LS300 is a great option to at least consider and see if it makes sense for you. For me, I wanted it to make sense. I wanted to love it. There are, people have pointed out there are some problems with the hardware design overall. It does feel kind of plasticky or a little bit cheaper in terms of build quality. But, most people nowadays who are looking for these budget camcorder type video cinema cameras, they're shooting on DSLRs, and a lot of them are, the cheaper, lower end ones. So that's not a huge drawback for me. As long as you treat your gear right, that shouldn't be a terrible problem in terms of the build quality. It didn't feel overly cheap. It just didn't feel as nice as something like an Ursa Mini or an FS7 or maybe an FS5. But it's been a while since I used the FS5, so they might actually be more similar in that regard. But I don't know what to say. I just wanted to kind of put those thoughts out there for anyone who is interested in the LS300, because when you look at it on paper, it looks very, very interesting. But when you look at the footage, and that sometimes that tells a different story. So if you have your own experiences, please let me know, share them in the comments below. And like I said, if you want to keep up with the stuff that I'm doing actively, you can go follow me on Instagram. I usually post photos and some videos from shoots and some behind the scenes setup. So that's more active rather than the YouTube stuff, which takes a little bit longer. So I probably will put together a proper LS300 review and overview with test footage samples and behind the scenes shots and just kind of like hardware rundown. But I had been getting a lot of comments on YouTube, people asking me about this camera and how it compares to other cameras I've shot with. So I wanted to make sure I got this out there as quick as possible so that people would be able to hopefully use my opinion to weigh and evaluate their own decisions.